Japan's Shinzo Abe has called for a snap election for just under 2 weeks from now in what many predict will be a two-horse race. What will be the fallout in the rest of the region as the result of the election? And as Saudi Arabia is set to ban missile systems from Russia and a rollout of the THAAD missile defense system from the United States, I'll be asking whether this will change the strategic balance in the Mideast. Welcome to The Point. I'm Zoe sitting in for Liu Xin. And we're starting Japan. Campaigning has officially kicked off in Japan ahead of elections for Japan's House of Representatives scheduled for October the 22nd. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, leading the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, and Tokyo Governor Yuriko Koike of the newly formed Party of Hope, dominated the eight-way debate at the National Press Club in Tokyo on Sunday. The 8 parties fighting the election have clashed over the future of the country's constitution, the role of the self-defense forces, and taxations. But Koike repeatedly said she will not resign as governor to run for the lower house. And Abe said he will step down if the LDP and Komeito fail to secure a majority of the seats. So, who will be left in the battle once the smoke clears away in the fortnight? And is Japan likely to be heading back to its old bellicose constitution? To talk about all these, I'm joined by Professor Takasato Watanabe from the Department of Media Studies at Toshisha University in Tokyo, and also Dr. Angus Lockyer, a lecturer of Japanese history at the School of Oriental and African Studies from the University of London. Welcome to both of you. Let me start with you, Angus. What do you make of the snap election called by Prime Minister Abe?
I think it was a pragmatic choice to call the election. I think he realized that this was probably the peak of his popularity over the next year before when he has to call it. But it's a strange decision in some ways. It wasn't a guaranteed result, and Koike came out and made some waves. But it looks as if at the present moment, indeed, the LDP will get back into power. They will probably have a reduced majority. And it seems to be also that the enthusiasm for the election, even on the first day of campaigning among the Japanese people, has somewhat ebbed. It seems a very lackluster affair, to be honest.
But he is confident that he will win.
I think he's confident. He's lowered expectations quite substantially. He said, you know, I will be happy with a simple majority. He's got quite a substantial majority at the moment, and you know, it's long been an ambition of his to revise the constitution, for which he'd need a 2/3 majority. It's probably not the case that he's going to get that, although who knows what's going to happen on the day. But he has lowered expectations in a somewhat surprising way. It's a kind of very defensive move on Abe's part in some ways.
And Mr. Watanabe, on the opposition side, Governor Koike has said she will not run for the lower house. Do you think she might change her mind? Why did he choose not to run for the lower house of the parliament if she is leading the Party of the Hope?
As far as I hear and listen to the TV discussions among all the leaders of political parties of Japan these days, Koike thinks to have some coalition with even the LDP, a part of the LDP, after the election. This is a strong, you see, imagination or guess of the political scholars in Japan. And Koike also thinks that she doesn't want to lose her power in the political world by getting less votes. So this is the reason why Koike did not decide to run for the lower house election as the candidate of the next coming prime minister.
So she can wield more power as the governor of Tokyo rather than the leader of the Party of the Hope, you think?
Nobody can guess, but everybody knows that Koike's party cannot get more than half majority. So she believed that she can play another role in the political world of Japan, not as the prime minister, but the leader of some party of the coalitions composing government leaders group, Komeito, LDP Jiminto, and Hope Party, and some other independent members. If those people can get more than half, this is very strong. And Mr. Abe is so afraid of losing the majority rule. He is very afraid of that. So even you see, Abe can join or the coalition with the Hope Party, Ms. Koike.
And Angus, what do you think Koike's joining the arena will change the political landscape in Japan?
I'm not sure it changes it at all, actually. In Japan, since the early 1950s, we've really had a 1.5-party system. And the Liberal Democratic Party, even more than the Conservative Party here in London, is the natural party of government. Koike was very much part of this. Her policy positions differ very little from Abe's.
But many of the Democratic parties have joined her party. Will that rally him up, her power?
Indeed, but the Democratic Party itself was a kind of reconfiguration of the earlier left, and it brought together some very unlikely bedfellows, if you like. So the Democratic Party has split in a way back to its natural homes. Of course, she even posed a litmus test on Democratic Party members to see if they were conservative enough to join the so-called Party of Hope. So in some ways, this doesn't feel new at all to me. Koike seems a very savvy political operator. She has some very nice phrases that she uses, but already as governor of Tokyo, we're beginning to hear whispers that, you know, she governs in a very LDP way. She's not very transparent. So I'm a little suspicious, I have to say.
Foreign policy-wise, do you think the Party of Hope, led by Koike, will turn Japanese foreign policy more right-wing? Because many people consider Koike as more right-leaning even than Abe. She visited Yasukuni Shrine several times. What do you think her foreign policy leverage will be, and what will that change Japan's foreign policy in the future if Abe came to power? Mr. Watanabe?
Ms. Koike was educated in the Cairo University in the Middle East, and she says always that political activities should be very realistic. In her sense, it is that the foreigners cannot, you see, have the voting right in Japan, even if they are paying the taxes. And also, she says that we should not, or we cannot admit the invasion to Korea, and also the massacres of more than 6,000 Koreans in Japan. It's in the historical record says like that. So in that sense, Ms. Koike is very conservative, or, you see, anti-liberalism. In that sense, Ms. Koike is more conservative than other, you see, liberal LDP's members. But Koike is very, very, you see, flexible. So she pays attention to the liberal parts of the Progressive Party, Democratic Party, the former Democratic Party. And also, she says many, you see, sweet things to the some members of the LDP. So we are not sure anybody in Japan now, you see, as far as they study what is going on now, no one can say that she will be something in the next stage. But she always says that we should wait the result of the election. I think, you see, she resigns from the post of the the leader of the Hope, even like that.
But
so we are not sure.
But obviously, both LDP and her party are running on a platform that will support amending the 70-year-old Constitution for the first time. Do you think the constitutional amendment is something inevitable? I want both of you weighing on that.
Yes.
Mr. Watanabe first, please.
Yes. If a Komeito party gets more than half with the LDP, it is not so easy to change the constitution because the members of the Komeito party is
against it.
You see, for the peaceful order. But if the Komeito and LDP cannot get this majority, Koike's party will join that. Then the possibility of amending the Constitution 9 becomes very big.
And
this
Angus,
is my analysis.
What is your take? Will that make the revision of the Constitution easier?
I think it's a tricky one. I think, as Professor Watanabe has suggested, in the immediate term, I think constitutional revision is unlikely. The reasons for this are there is, in fact, a majority, it seems from the latest public opinion surveys, in favor of revising the Constitution. The Constitution is, in fact, a Cold War anachronism. It was imposed on Japan by the Americans. And it is out of line with both the reality in Japan, which does have a very powerful army and a navy, and the current situation both in the region and the world. So I think in the long term, constitutional revision will happen. But
now, do you think the Japanese public is all in to support this already?
No, not all in at all. It's very much a split thing, and there is. I'd be interested in looking on the generational breakdown on this, but there is a gradual, I think, growing, but slowly growing awareness in Japan that, the Constitution isn't fit for purpose. I speak from a country which doesn't have a written constitution. And indeed, most constitutions are revised. The American Constitution has had 6 amendments, I believe, since the war. So it's unusual that Japan is still living with this constitution, which is over half a century old and has never been changed. So I think there's an awareness in Japan that things do have to change. But I don't think, and this is a really important point, that this means a return to militarism. I mean, there is always going to be clear water.
So it's not returning to militarism, and Mr. Watanabe, it seems there is still ambiguity about the status of the defense forces. Will the Constitution unequivocally say that the security forces in Japan will turn into a normal army as everybody else in the world?
When it comes to the amendment of the Constitution, there are 2 points. First one is Article 9, as we have suggested. Second one is some other parts of the Constitution say the right of the opinions of the local government in the central government of Japan. So there are 2 things. However, as far as the Article 9 is concerned, I believe that if the LDP or ruling party in the next election does not admit the invasion of Asian countries like China, Korea, and other East Asian countries, it is very, very dangerous to amend the Constitution 9, because without this kind of the understanding of the past history, Japan might be, going to the a bit higher dimension of going to anywhere with the United States armies. This is very difficult and also very dangerous.
And Angus, what is the odds of this that will finally substantiate? And what is the impact on the rest of Asia, especially China and Korea?
I think that's an unanswerable question in some ways. I think, as Professor Watanabe has suggested, any constitutional revision has to proceed in line with a profound understanding of the impact on the rest of the region. My hope, of course, is that pragmatism rules. The danger at the moment is throughout East Asia, and indeed further afield, of course, what we see is a resurgent nationalism, not only in Japan. In Japan, I think it's a minority. I think it's a minority in most places. But I think it's a tricky moment globally. And so if Abe somehow were to proceed with constitutional revision, first, I think he'd have a domestic political crisis on his hands, because it's clear that he doesn't have the majority of the country with him at the moment. And I think also, as Professor Watanabe has underlined very succinctly, it's time in East Asia for governments to be aware of the need for kind of regional connections, regional discussions, which acknowledge the past indeed. I think East Asia is not alone in not coming to terms with its past very successfully. Very few countries have. But the time has come for all of us, I think, to be aware that stuff did happen in the middle of the 20th century, and we need to acknowledge that it happened.
All right.
Once you have that shared understanding, and there are some initiatives along these lines, you can proceed.
Come to grips with history first. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Takasato Watanabe from the Shisha University in Tokyo, and also Dr. Angus Fakia from University of London. You've been watching The Point here on CGTN. We'll be back in a minute. And now to Saudi Arabia. The U.S. State Department approved a sale of Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD, missile defense to Saudi Arabia last Friday. According to a press release from the Pentagon, the total package will include 44 THAAD launchers, 360 THAAD interceptor missiles, 16 mobile fire control and communication stations, and 7 THAAD radars. Well, the Pentagon said the $15 billion deal furthered U.S. national security and foreign policy interests, and that it would boost Gulf security against Iranian and other threats. Well, the announcement comes today after Saudi Arabia and Russia signed billion-dollar arms deal during King Salman's visit to Moscow. Well, Saudi Arabia agreed to buy air defense system also from Russia, including the S-400 system. So what is behind these deals, and why is Saudi Arabia upgrading its missiles defense system right at the moment? Joining me from Amman is Dr. Florence E. Oakden, CEO and Chief Economist for Arabia Monitor, a leading independent research firm that specializes in the Middle East. And from Tel Aviv, we have Mr. Mir Javandafar, Middle East analyst. Let me start with you first, Javandafar. According to the Pentagon, the possible sale of a THAAD anti-missile defense systems to Saudi Arabia will cost $15 billion. That's a huge arms deal for Saudi Arabia and also America. What is behind the deal? Why it is being postponed for so long? Javandafar?
I think one of the main reasons why Saudi Arabia is now investing so much money in anti-missile systems is because of the threat posed from Yemen. Let's not forget that Saudi Arabia is right now involved in a war against Houthi militia in Yemen, and Saudi Arabian targets have been hit by missiles launched from Yemen, and there's a concern in Saudi Arabia that the Houthis are going to improve their missile arsenal, and that will put important Saudi strategic assets potentially in range of missiles perhaps in the future. So the Saudis are not taking any chances, and they're buying the most sophisticated systems there are, one of them being the THAAD, as you quite rightly mentioned, and the other one being the S-400. But I think there's another reason why the Russians are going for both Russian and why the Saudis are going for both Russian and American weapons. They're trying to diversify their weapons supplies, and also by having not just American but Russian weapons, they are hoping to use the $3 billion weapons deal that they have with Russia in order to pressure Russia and in other areas which is important to them, one of them being Syria and the other one being the issue of Yemen, which is also important to the Russians.
Florence, where do you think Saudi Arabia's reading of threat come from?
Forgive me, if the question was for me, I didn't quite hear it. Where does Saudi Arabia's what come from?
I want your take on what do you think the Saudi Arabia's reading of the strategic threat is coming from? Is it from Houthi rebels in Yemen, or is it from Iran, from Syria? Where do you think is the main direction of threat coming?
Saudi Arabia obviously is most immediately worried about the situation in Yemen, because that's on its border, and it is quite serious, because there have been incursions across the border and there are villages there at the border. But also Yemen is a sizable neighboring country. Saudi Arabia also views Iran as an immediate threat, in the sense that what we've seen as of late is a revival of the centuries-old rivalry between the two countries. Obviously, the situation in Syria is a worry for Saudi Arabia, although that's not as immediate and not as close as the situation with Yemen, and the threat isn't as significant as the situation perceived out of Saudi Arabia with Iran. Syria is connected to Iran, as you well know, in terms of the conflict. And Iran has been playing a role in Yemen as well, so directly or indirectly. I would say the largest threat is probably Iran to Saudi Arabia, and the closest in terms of geographic proximity is obviously Yemen.
And talking about THAAD, because in East Asia, the deployment of THAAD in South Korea has actually tipped the balance of strategic deterrence in this part of the world. Do you think similar things will happen in the Gulf region, because Saudi Arabia is buying military assets from both Russia and the United States, and Iran will probably follow suit to buff up its military capabilities? Florence?
I think, yes, I think unfortunately the heightened level of risk in the region implies that the various players will most likely arm up. In terms of their capabilities, they're likely to invest more in weapons, and that's an unfortunate consequence of the ramping up of risks in the region all around. Will this affect the Gulf directly? I think at this stage not necessarily, but it will certainly impact expenditures. And in any case, as part of the diversification drive, the expenditures on weapons from countries like Russia but also China have increased over the past couple of years. I think the Americans were tried and tested by the Obama administration, and the Saudis found that the U.S. isn't necessarily as reliable of a partner as they have always thought it would be. And therefore there's been this visit by King Salman, a historic visit to Russia, the first by a sitting monarch from Saudi Arabia, but also we have seen as of late increasing purchases of arms from China, and collaboration with China on the manufacture of, say, drones in Saudi Arabia with Chinese technology. So there's a broader diversification effort in terms of the purchase of weapons by Saudis from other countries than the United States.
And Mr. Javed, what do you think Iran will respond to this?
I think even before this announcement, we were expecting a stronger retaliation from Iran in the region through support for groups that are mainly anti-American, and as an extension perhaps also anti-Saudi. And the reason being that it's expected that President Trump is going to place the Revolutionary Guards, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, it's going to define them as a terrorist organization. And this is most probably going to mean that Iran is going to support groups across the region, especially the Houthis, I think, which Iran sees as an ally, although it's not as close as Hezbollah, of course, but Iran sees as an ally against the Saudis and also against the Americans. We should not forget that also Houthis have targeted American ships, at least on one occasion recently. So Iran is going to most probably invest even more in its missile program. Iran does not have a capable anti-missile system yet, and because of its strained relations with America, it's not going to be able to buy the THAAD. The Iranians do have the S-300 system, which is the older version of the S-400. Although I don't know how powerful that will be, especially against Israel. According to Reuters, the Israeli Air Force has already done maneuvers against these missiles in Greece, which already has the S-300 missiles. We can assume that was with Russian permission. So the best Iran can do right now most probably is going to be to invest even more in its missile program and to help its allies or groups that identify with it.
And earlier you mentioned this is actually a diversification from Saudi Arabia to buy both U.S. and Russian military equipment. Do you think it is a smart move? What might be problems for Saudi Arabia to have both Russian and American equipment?
The various purchases
if
of
I were
equipment
Saudi Arabian pro-monarchist, I would say it was a very smart move.
Speak first, please. Mr. Javandafar, your take first.
Thank you. If I were a Saudi pro-monarchist, I would say yes, it's a smart move because it's not, especially when it comes to weapons, you don't want to be dependent on just one country. Because if you're just dependent on one country and they know that you're dependent on them and them only, they can use it as leverage to pressure you.
Okay.
And when your national interests clash, if you're just dependent on one country for supply of weapons, then you may not, that would limit your decision making. And that could mean that sometimes you have
Florence,
to
is there any pitfalls if Saudi Arabia is
so the Saudis
obviously
are
hedging
the major players
in this weapons acquisition? Florence?
Forgive me, I didn't hear the question. Would you kindly repeat it?
Because Saudi Arabia is buying both Russian and American weapons. Do you think that might be problems and pitfalls right ahead? Because obviously the two systems are not compatible.
Obviously there's a cost-benefit analysis to this. Having multiple systems implies potential confusion because of system incompatibility, as you rightly point out. However, the benefit is diversification, as we've been saying. Not putting all of one's eggs in one basket, and also benefiting from changes in technology and different offerings from different countries in terms of technology.
Right.
These weapons purchases come with contracts for maintenance.
We're running up to time. Thank you.
They normally are siloed.
Thank you very much, Florence, and thank you, Mr. Javandafar. We're running out of time. Thank you very much for your analysis here. You've been watching The Point here on CGTN. I'm Joe Yeh, sitting in for News Today. Goodbye.